Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Dr. Scott Thumma to the show. Scott Thumma is Professor of Sociology of Religion and Director of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research at Hartford International University in Hartford, Connecticut. He has published numerous articles, research reports, and chapters on religious life, in addition to co-authoring 3 books. He has researched and written on megachurches, evangelicalism, gay religious life, congregational studies, and the rise of non-denominational churches along with the changing religious landscape. Scott is the principal investigator for the 5-year Lilly Endowment Grant to study the impact of the pandemic on churches. He co-leads the Faith Communities Today National Research Project and has conducted national studies of megachurches in non-denominational churches. He is also a member of the team that recently conducted the 2020 U.S. Religious Census of U.S. congregations. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Scott Thumma. Thank you so much for your time today and looking forward to this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Well, as you said, I'm a researcher at Hartford International University and the director of the Hartford Institute, which has studied congregational life and denominational life for 45 years or so. And I myself have looked at how congregations are changing now over the last 30 plus years. And, what we're seeing now is a pretty interesting and challenging time. So it's really exciting, but also sometimes a little depressing. It's a great career, and I love doing the work and the research that we do.
Yeah, great. Share, if you would, a little bit about your faith journey, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Sure. Sometimes I feel like I was born a sociologist of religion. I grew up in an independent Baptist church, a relatively small conservative congregation in central Pennsylvania. And but even from a fairly early age, but especially by junior high school, I was asking the kinds of questions like, why are we worshiping the way we are, when I see some of my friends or go visit a girlfriend's church or something and they do things differently. And that has really compelled a lot of my own faith journey, both personally in my relationship with God, but also in my relationship with congregations and denominations, and so consequently, I have moved from one denomination, one congregation to another throughout the course of my life. Probably belonged to 30 different congregations over time, and maybe a dozen different denominations. I was at a Methodist college, and then went to Candler, which is a Methodist seminary, and so belonged to a Methodist church for a while. I belonged to a Disciples church for a while. I belonged to a number of charismatic fellowships over time. I also belonged to a couple different non-denominational churches. And but I really, in some sense, have never left what I think of as my roots in independent Baptist, which was, what really matters is the congregation you're a part of, more so than a denomination you're a part of. And so that has always sort of guided my direction. once I became a social science researcher of congregational life, that kind of took precedent to my own connection to a congregation, because I find myself in many different congregations throughout the year. And also when you do this job, and I would guess when you do church consulting and things, it's really hard to belong to one congregation, because that congregation wants you to help and they want you to consult, and that's not always why you go to worship in a faith group, and so it makes it a little harder to have my own home. But sometimes I think of it as much more expansive. It allows me to have multiple homes, to experience the variety of religious expressions. I've studied megachurches most of my career. I love that kind of contemporary worship, kind of lively and exciting.
Yeah.
But I also love being in African American congregations. I live in New England now, and there's not a whole lot of that. I get more United Church of Christ and Episcopal, but I really flourish on the multiple ways that people craft their worship and their relationship with God. So I really am a kind of sociologist at heart in some ways.
Yeah. Sociologists, y'all are my favorite people to talk to just because your amount of nerdiness. I don't know if you've come across Todd Ferguson, a sociologist of religion.
He's actually part of our pandemic research that we're doing.
I had him on along with Josh Packer, and he talks about taking notes in high school, going to church. Like, I'm a church nerd and I'm not near that level of nerdiness. So I appreciate you sociologists. Any spiritual practices that you found meaningful or important for you in your life or of late?
Yeah. Well, throughout my life, early on, clearly reading the Bible, going to church, the typical sort of growing up in the church kinds of practices. But by the time I became a young adult, I spent a good bit of time in Korea. I was in the military for a while, and that introduced me, along with Foster's book on spiritual practices and some other stuff, to the practice of journaling, to the practice of paying attention to my dreams, and also then got really into fasting, actually, for quite a long period, and have done 30-day fast and a 40-day fast and a number of 2-week-long fasts, and that was when I was younger. Family and some other things took the place of some of that. And in fact, I actually had a spiritual life retreat with a colleague when we were in seminary for young adults who were in 12-step programs. And they would learn about, the higher powers and all that sort of thing. And so what we tried to do was introduce them to spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices that would allow them, we couldn't teach them about a particular religion, but we could give them some of these spiritual practices that would help them maybe ground some of what they were trying to do with 12 steps. Now I've gotten back into some journaling, but especially paying attention to my dreams and increasingly doing a lot of long walks and spending time kind of listening and being attentive and intentional about spending time outside and kind of away from computers, away from stimulation.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks for sharing that. So I had Dr. Thumma on to talk about, we're going to kind of just nerd out, at least I am, listening to you talking about some of your areas of study here and some topics related there. So you mentioned megachurches off the top, and that's certainly an area of interest that I have. And I think, let me frame it from this. Like, I just got the mailer, kind of community neighborhood magazine, and on the front cover is the Christmas Eve service for the megachurch here within 5-7 miles from me. And it's the great marketing, they're talking about like win prizes and fun for the whole family. And, I have mixed feelings about this, we'll say.
Right.
But also I kind of recognize like this is where the world's at. And the question I want to ask kind of on this is, from my perspective, at least in the broader economy, we're really seeing this trend of just like size and growth is everything. Like maybe this will change with like the era of like low interest rates gone, but it seemed like every company was sacrificing even profitability for the sake of growth. And once they get that growth, they can kind of just dominate the marketplace. So is this megachurch model, is this really just an outgrowth of the modern economy?
Well, I wouldn't say just, but I think that's part of what has fueled the megachurch movement since the 1960s, 1970s, and certainly onward. Right, there's a real congruence between what the megachurches offer and what Disney offers and what the malls offer and large corporations and such too. So I think you can't divorce it from the context that it's in, for sure. But there's also this larger change that has been happening both to American, stay with America, both to American society, but also then reflected in our religious reality. And that is, as the populations have both increased in the United States, but also moved from rural areas, small towns, into concentrated metropolitan areas, what we've seen is a diminishment in some sense of small congregations.
Yeah.
And this increasing concentration in the larger congregations. Now, that doesn't just mean megachurches, but the top 10% of churches in the country have about 70% of the people. Right, I know. It's actually
10%,
hard to believe. Yeah.
Top 10% have 70% of people?
Yep. So there's about 350,000 congregations in the country, based on the U.S. religion census data that just came out recently that I was actually a part of. So that means that about 35,000 congregations in the country have about 70% of all the people.
Wow.
Now, if I ask you where's that cutoff for the top 10%, I guarantee you'll get it wrong. It's actually 250 people in attendance.
Okay.
So that's not very big.
Right.
But between 250 and 30, 40,000 in the largest one in the country, that really is a relatively small number of churches. But that's where all the people have concentrated to, and that includes Catholic. That also includes non-Christian, but it really, obviously is dominated by Christian congregations, but that most people don't perceive that. Even though most people are in big churches, and by big I might mean 300, they don't think of that as big, but they also don't realize that about 90% of congregations in the U.S. are significantly smaller. The median size, which is the midway point between that 350,000, is now, based on our most recent data, 60 people in attendance. So half the congregations in the country have 60 people in worship or less.
Yeah.
And we don't see those. They're everywhere,
right?
But they're not making the news. They're not doing the major, Christmas pageant. But they also support the AA meetings. They have soup kitchens and many faithful people. It's just not the proportions are very, very out of whack. I mean, it's like the financial distribution in our country as well. Yeah.
So let me ask this about megachurches, because one thing, and I'm going to frame this from an economic lens, like the classic economic principles of economies of scale and specialization of labor is obviously to again use an economic framework, two economic advantages that a megachurch has, or even frankly a church of, like you said, top 10% church, if I'm understanding you right, is 250 people or more in attendance.
Okay.
So even if it's not a quote unquote mega church, it's gonna be a church of probably multiple staff members or paid persons who work for the church, clergy at least. Like, and again, I'm kind of framing this through this kind of economic market model here. Is that just an advantage that's just going to be continuing to be compelling? This idea that, like, they have the specialization of labor, so they can have, a dedicated children's ministry. They can have dedicated women's ministry and men's ministry and on and on and on. And also, like, because of the economies of scale, like, obviously some mega church Christmas productions like we've seen on social media are out of this world,
right.
But also because they're putting on 5 services, the economies of scale, again, kind of balance out. So I guess what I'm wondering in this roundabout way, are we just going to keep seeing this? Are we going to keep seeing this dynamic of mega churches becoming like, and smaller churches dying out and mega churches, or not mega churches, but 250 plus churches becoming the norm?
Well, I do think that the concentration of people in larger congregations is probably going to continue, because I don't see folks distributing out from urban areas. There was a little bit of that during the pandemic, right? But the advantages of being in a metropolitan area outweigh being out in a rural area.
Right.
That doesn't mean that a lot of those small congregations are going to completely disappear.
Right.
There are some that will disappear, I think, in the next 10, 20 years. But a small rural area can actually support a small church forever.
Yeah.
However, you're absolutely right that when you have a large congregation, even of 500, what it can offer in terms of, outstanding worship, all of the possible programs and activities for the whole family, really, just small congregations can't exactly compete head to head with that sort of reality. And that's not even talking about once you get to 2 to 5 to 10,000.
Right.
But in some sense, I've already seen in the couple decades that I've watched megachurches, megachurches had gotten to a point 15, 20 years ago where they were creating one large congregation and would pack in 5,000, 10,000. And what we've seen over the last decade or more is a more distributed model.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, you're already seeing, it's not really a fragmentation of that large, because they still think of themselves as one whole.
Right.
But you can't talk about Life Church or any number of other. In fact, almost 80% of megachurches now are multi-site. I think there are some different dynamics, but one of the things that the megachurches have, however they're structured, is they know that they have to do every aspect of church life with intentionality. Right? They have to think about small groups. They have to think about how do we onboard new people. They have to think about how do we structure our programs. And when you get to a congregation of 50 or 75 or 100, oftentimes they say, oh, well, this will happen naturally, right? A new person will find their way in our congregation, right?
Right.
And so it's done in a kind of informal, ad hoc manner, and that may work, but it may not work, and that's where one of the things I think that smaller congregations can learn from larger. They have to do these things intentionally because our society has changed. That we're not as interconnected in the rest of our lives as we once were. So, there are some clear disadvantages to the large scale worship, but there are also lessons that all congregations could learn.
Yeah, because I tend to listen to a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but some podcasts that are tend to be geared toward larger churches. And obviously the big thing that I keep hearing again and again is like kind of the paths, it seems like big churches always offer this like path to like kind of, it's like your step, I don't know what the word would be, but it's like follow these steps to kind of grow. And it's like a self-prescribed.
That's right. Yeah, the Saddleback bases or any of those others. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of along with this, and you could correct me, you could fine tune kind of how these two went in parallel, is the rise in non-denominational churches. And I think this is interesting for me. I've been a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, ordained 10 years this summer. I worked for a few different mainline churches. Interestingly enough, we'll have to talk about this offline here, and grew up independent Baptist like you. So some familiarity with a lack of denominational structure. But I think, I don't know, speaking for myself at least, like I feel like growing up independent Baptist, while there was very much that, like you said, this congregational autonomy, there was still some appreciation for the tradition, at least of like the Baptist tradition only.
Right. The heritage, yes.
Right, the heritage, that's a better way of saying it. So, and I'll just say, like, I went recently to a non-denom, fairly progressive church to visit. And for me, I found it like weird that I feel like this smorgasbord of traditions and things smushed together. But obviously, like, I seem to be in the minority. So what's going on with non-denominationalism right now?
Yeah. I mean, this is a major area of my work. When I was part of the U.S. religion census and realized back in 2005 or something that that they hadn't done a very good count of non-denominational churches. So in 2010, I tried to and found that was actually, if that was a group, it would be the second largest grouping after the Southern Baptist.
Wow.
And in 2020, we tried again, and we've actually found that grouping, if you could put them together, has now eclipsed the Southern Baptist. So it's actually probably the largest Protestant reality.
Wow.
But I mean, I think you're right. I myself personally am not so inclined toward non-denominational life either. But I'm not your typical consumer of congregational life.
Me either.
But I do think there are some significant advantages, at least in our modern context. Clearly, denominational identity has lost salience.
Right.
People don't understand it. I mean, folks, or they do understand it and they're carrying around baggage. And so if you say Episcopal, they have a picture, or you say Southern Baptist, they know what that means. And so, you see denominational congregations shift away from emphasizing their denomination, changing their names of their churches to Crossroads, or to, Brook Hollow congregation. But it also means that as we have increasing numbers of non affiliated people, the nuns and such, or just folks who may be spiritual but never really grew up in a congregation, those identities don't mean anything. And so we're just a non-denominational church. And when somebody asks, what's that mean? Well, you have to come see, right?
Right.
And so you can't prejudge a congregation usually until you get in there and worship, and then they hope that their hospitality team and everything makes you feel welcome. And but I think there are challenges to that. One of them is oftentimes, not always, there are few kind of connections and oversight and and that kind of checks and balances sometimes, and so that's a possibility that might happen. But you also have this, I mean, in some ways, much more generic sense of this is Christianity generally, and usually tending more toward conservative, more evangelical theological understanding, at least based on our surveys of non-denominational churches. Now, obviously, that's not true. There's also progressive ones too, but yeah, you may lose a lot of the heritage, or even some of the rituals. Most non-denominational churches revel in some ways in the fact that they can craft the worship that corresponds to who they are, and but as opposed to, say, maybe an Episcopal church that never can vary from the Book of Common Prayer or something. But it does diminish, I think, the richness of what's possible, unless you have a creative person that's eclectically pulling different kinds of things together.
It seems like there are some non-denoms, maybe at least in my neck of the woods, who are starting to pay a little bit more attention to like Advent, Lent. Do you think are you seeing that as well?
I am seeing that. I'm seeing that both in non-denominational churches and also in the evangelical denominational congregations as well. And I think some of that is a good pendulum swing back toward a sense of orthodoxy and ritual, and you also see evangelical and other young men joining the Orthodox Church, right? Which is a little mind-boggling, but I understand the appeal.
Let me ask.
In a society that has no longer a single dominant culture, but many fragmented subcultures, I think it's fascinating to me to be able to see the diversity of religious expressions, because it really is matching some of this subcultural diversity.
So let me ask this. It seems like, in my mind, what I've always heard is that non-denoms stereotypically are either really they're Baptist or Pentecostal. Is that, it's a bit broad brush, but is that somewhat fair? Well, at least that's the roots they come from. Does that make sense? I would say some Baptist traditions, but I just tend to usually say they're broadly evangelical. Okay.
Or they lean more toward the Spirit, and they're generally Pentecostal. But some of that Pentecostal came out of the charismatic movement in the 70s and 80s, and now doesn't really look like Pentecostalism. It's more kind of a charismatic of sorts. Okay. And increasingly, I think we're seeing, both with some of the fracturing of the mainline denominations, but also just creative younger clergy who are trying to craft a religious spiritual space that appeals to younger generations and doesn't echo their parents' and grandparents' reality, that it's really becoming a pretty creative space, not tied to some of those heritages as it was probably 15, 20 years ago.
One tradition that I've been kind of intrigued about from the outside is the Anglican Church. And I don't mean the Anglican Church of Canada, but I mean the Anglicans who've kind of split off from the Episcopals. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like from what I've seen, they've done an interesting, what seems like a good job of balancing rich tradition and ritual with also some modern aesthetics that seems to be compelling to young people. And I'm just curious, A, is that an accurate observation? And B, might they have something to teach or to be a guide to mainline traditions?
Yeah. And many of those also tend toward the middle or to the right of the theological spectrum, right? But I think you're right. The Church of the Apostles, I think in Atlanta is certainly, I think that's what the name of that church is, larger, but there's a whole host of them. They do walk a nice line between the ritual of the Episcopal Church, kind of Anglican tradition, and then bringing in some contemporary worship. And you also see it in some of the immigrant expressions within the Anglican movement or within the Episcopal Church, where they still have the book Common Prayer of sorts and the high regard for the Eucharist and things like that to kind of keep them anchored, but they allow cultural expressions that are not organ based or not 300-year-old hymns kind of to bring in some kind of fresh resonance with the contemporary reality. I mean, I work with a lot of younger clergy in the mainline and constantly pushing them to go and reinvent worship and reinvent what Christianity really needs to look like for younger generations. Because it's pretty clear from our data that it's hasn't been working for the mainline, and increasingly it's not working so well for the evangelical conservative Protestants either. Our society is moving pretty significantly away from the social reality that created the congregations of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And some groups have adopted some aspects of that, and that's where you get the megachurches and the charismatic movement and some of this stuff. But that continues because culture keeps shifting and the society keeps shifting. But we're really slow to reinvent our religious forms and models, and we need to. There's no doubt about it.
Let me ask this then. So I think this comes from Ted Smith, and I haven't had a chance to read his book, The End of Theological Education, here on my stack of books to read. Yeah. But I heard this in another podcast from him, and he talked about the voluntary association being like the primary social model, if that's the correct word, of how congregations are organized basically since the American Revolution. It seems like previous to that would have been the state church. I don't know how far. Well, would there have been a prior to? Like how far back would the state church go, essentially?
Well, I mean, it would probably go back to the Protestant Reformation, right?
Okay.
I mean, prior to that, it was a mono religion. I mean, obviously the split between the Orthodox and Catholic, but then it was the Catholic Church.
Right.
or it was,
So Ted Smith, if I'm remembering correctly from this conversation I listened to, made the point that, or at least as I interpreted it, that it's the voluntary association model that seems to be dying, not what we'd theologically call the church. So the question is I'm curious about, like, what is that new model that's going to be like the social cohesion? And I'm wondering, is asset-based community development, like, there seems to be a lot of energy around that in some mainline spheres. Like, is that the new model? Like, do you know what the new model is going to be?
I wish I did.
Okay.
I'd write a book.
Yeah.
I'm of the mind that, as I hinted to you earlier, that really our society has fractured so much into different subcultural realities that, cowboy church or biker church or
these are all real
church
things.
that all of those
CrossFit church.
Yeah, exactly. And some of our most creative young clergy here in New England have their traditional church that anchors them in the denomination, but then they also do CrossFit ministry, or they do poetry slam ministry that actually functions very well for a younger community. I anticipate that there's not going to really be one dominant model.
Okay.
And that's in part because our whole social fabric has shifted from small towns or the competition between 7 different congregations within that town to move to now this major metropolitan area that has the vast majority of our people in it. And then that we play out to all these different subcultural. You go into a mall and look, and there's like 14 different stores that all sell jeans, and almost all the jeans are the same.
Right.
But they're selling a brand and an identity, and maybe trying to sell it in a different way with different styling. And I think in some sense, we're seeing that reflected in congregational life and how that's done, whether it's done with dinner church or bar church or some, kind of spiritual expression or whatever. But, and I don't know. We'll have to see. But it is, we are in a period of significant change in our society. And while we're living through it, who knows how long this is, but the technological changes that have taken place and the globalization kinds of things, but then to throw in the significant impact that the pandemic has had on not just congregational life, but really on reshaping human nature and our nature of interacting. We're in our pandemic research, we're still seeing pretty significant impact by that traumatic event, both in the congregational members and in the people who've left and in the clergy. And so while many congregations have said, oh, well, the pandemic's over, we're moving on.
Right.
They really haven't fully dealt with the influence of all of that yet. I think it's going to take another decade at least to sort all of this stuff out.
Wow. Last question here before we take a break. So you mentioned like small towns, 7 churches competing with one another, let's say, for back in the days, right? The bus route. Did your church do that?
Right.
The bus program?
Every Baptist church did.
Right, the bus ministry. Moving to cities now where people are driving 30, 40 minutes to go to church because there's a big mega church competing with each other. But really these days, like, it's the internet where churches are competing with each other across the globe, essentially. And maybe not in traditional, let's get you to come to church, but it's like Elevation and Bethel and these kind of churches producing their worship content that is the new latest hit or song or whatever. Talk about how the internet is really shaping churches and congregational dynamics.
Right. Well, and certainly when you talk about Bethel and some others, right, the research that has been out that, a vast number of congregations that are more contemporary that use the work from 4 or 5 churches, right? I mean, it's as bad as the music scene in contemporary society. I honestly, I don't think we're yet fully aware of what effect all of this will have on congregational life.
Sure.
Prior to the pandemic, there was still a relative handful of congregations that were truly implementing technology in the life of their congregation.
Right.
Whether that was in worship or in the administration or in the publicity of sorts, their evangelical outreach kind of things. And the pandemic was a real wake-up call, and it was really helpful for the congregations that had already started it. What we're seeing now, though, is many of those congregations, and it was nearly 100%, while about 75% are still doing hybrid worship forms and such.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at all of the programs they do and all the other activities, most of those have retreated back to face-to-face realities. They might still be using it a little bit for adult education, might be using it to have committee meetings, but pretty much everything else has kind of snapped back to where it was before. But what hasn't changed is that membership wants that option of being able to zoom in or to watch the streaming. Or the folks who never got reached, who were homebound or whatever, are now able to participate. But they also have the challenge of how do you deliver the full expression of what a church is to those folks who are virtual. They're willing to allow for talking head spectator participation, but that's not a robust congregational life. So I think where congregations, and this includes the megachurches as well, our challenge now is how do we deliver all those other aspects of congregational life to a virtual audience so that it's a robust expression of Christianity and community, and not just, I'm watching televangelists, who are less good televangelists.
Right. Well,
so, it remains to be seen the effect. What one of the other effects, and then I'll stop, is that those religious participants, even the ones that are sitting in your pews, we're pretty sure are also viewing other congregations. They're also participating in others. We have a few studies or a few surveys we've done where we're asking attenders, where else do they worship? Do they have other home churches that they're a part of?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is a pretty significant overlap between multiple congregations. And that may have always existed, but we never asked those survey questions, but we are now.
Interesting.
And I think, that kind of constant sort of shopping around or getting my various needs met in multiple congregations is really the future for sure.
Yeah. And we need to take a break here for sake of time. But I'm just thinking this is probably I'm probably an example. Like I'll watch a Hillsong YouTube video. I'll listen to somebody else's sermon podcast. Right? These are all examples, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll come back with some closing questions. We're back with Dr. Scott Thumma, and love this conversation here. Wish we had more time. So I'm springing these questions on you because you really have not seen them. Most people I send these questions to, but they're meant to be quick responses. So don't feel the need to go into depth. But if you're Pope for a day, then you can take this as seriously or not as you'd like to. What might you want to do with that day?
Well, I'd have to say, stop some of this conflict.
Sure.
I mean, we're in a pretty rough moment.
Well, I'd be down with that. I would be down with that. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Well, Martin Luther.
Okay.
I mean, he drank beer and he called his wife a ball and chain.
He's a character. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Well, yeesh, I can go so many different directions there.
Sure.
But, I'm so immersed in doing pandemic research right now that I hope history remembers this as a more interesting time, understanding how congregations adapted to the pandemic than in the 1918 one, because we tried to get some data from that and had nothing. So, but oh goodness, we're in a challenging time for sure.
It's interesting. I have a clergy friend who was at an old Disciples of Christ church here in Denver, and he actually was able to look back in some kind of her church record books and see that they closed for like 3 or 4 weeks in 1918, and that was the extent of the data he had. But still pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can look at some denominational data and you see an impact over a year or two, but there's not a lot of richer material.
Yeah. What do you hope for the future of Christianity? And this might be challenging for you, a sociologist, right?
I want it to change. I've often said in my talks that that every clergy person needs to think about how is their institutional reality in their congregation changing, and if it's not changing, then it's dying.
Right.
And one of our key questions that we have in our surveys is your congregation willing and open to change? And that is so predictive of many other aspects of the congregation. That's just have to remain flexible. And we saw this amazing 2-year period where nearly every congregation made change.
Yeah.
And now what we're seeing is the concrete starting to harden and settle, and the clergy still want to continue to change, and the membership are like, we've done all we can. We're not going to change anymore. And that is just a death knell in some ways.
Well, this is great stuff here. I really wish we had more time for a conversation, but to honor your time and mine, let's wrap it there. But where can people find out more about your work and connect with you if they want to do that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, at the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, we're fixing up the website, but at hartfordinstitute.org. We also have a project called Faith Communities Today, faithcommunitiestoday.org, that has been going on for 20 plus years. And then our pandemic research is covidreligionresearch.org. And we will have in the next week or two a great report on Latino congregations, and then a report that we've just finished doing on clergy health and wellness that is sobering, to say the least.
I bet. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Well, thank you. And Thanks for the invitation, Lauren. This has been great.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.